On this Saturday night, a humanitarian ceasefire declared and broken. A halt in fighting to allow Ukrainians to leave the country ends abruptly, stranding thousands without food, water, or heat. A desperate plea for help, while Vladimir Putin renews a threat and the U.S. warns its citizens to leave Russia immediately. Exodus from war and the terrifying reality for those who stay behind. And a Canadian city with deep Ukrainian roots rallies to help friends and family a world away.
Glory to Ukraine.
Global National. Reporting tonight, Colleen Christie.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. The first ceasefire attempted in Ukraine to evacuate civilians collapsed not long after it began. Ukrainian officials accuse Russia of breaking the partial truce. Efforts to allow more than 200,000 people to escape the fighting have halted, residents forced to turn back. Aid agencies warn the humanitarian crisis will grow more dire as food, water, and medical supplies run short. David Akin has our top story.
The Ukrainian city of Mariupol, a strategic port on the Sea of Azov, has been surrounded by Russian troops for days. Many of its 450,000 residents without water, electricity, or heat, as bombs and shells rain down. Civilians desperately sought shelter. There had been hope at least half of those residents might have been allowed to leave under a Russian proposed ceasefire that guaranteed a humanitarian corridor. But it was not to be. As Ukrainians said, the Russians continued the shelling. We continue working without electricity, water, and heat, this doctor says. We have some issues with supplies. We worked more than a week without a break. Municipal officials say the city may run out of food. We don't have food supplies, says this woman. People are taking everything. Shops are empty.
The weakness of everything that's happening is that we're relying on the good faith of the Russians, which we can't do. They've just invaded, and what I think there's much evidence of criminal activity.
In a village north of Kyiv, Yulia Yanchar is looking for a way that she and her daughter can leave. Her daughter is defiant.
We will not be scared of anything. And I am 6 years old. Slava Ukraini.
At the train station in Kyiv, Igor Kiriyenko sends his son and family to the west and to safety, while he promises to stay fighting. The Black Sea port city of Kherson was captured by the Russians, but thousands crowded the city square there Saturday to protest, as video emerged of Russian military vehicles destroyed in the fight for Kherson.
The Russian army is not unbeatable. Putin is not unbeatable. In this context, it's only he has the vetoes that we allow him to have, and if we say no, you don't have a veto, then we can push back.
But by the end of the weekend, authorities believe 1.5 million people will have left Ukraine, fleeing Putin's army. David Akin, Global News.
Russian President Vladimir Putin warned today any third-party declaration of a no-fly zone over Ukraine would be seen as participation in the war. It came as Ukraine's president begged U.S. lawmakers to push NATO into action and asked for more humanitarian aid as the refugee crisis worsens. Jennifer Johnson has the latest.
Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelenskyy had a Zoom call with more than 300 U.S. lawmakers, pleading for help in getting NATO to declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine. NATO is refusing, saying it could lead to a full-fledged war in Europe. On Saturday, Russia President Vladimir Putin warned that could be seen by Moscow as a step into the military conflict. NATO is also refusing to supply Ukraine with fighter jets. Lawmakers promised to push U.S. President Joe Biden to make that happen.
There are planes available by NATO nations, MiGs, that the Ukrainians can fly. They're waiting to be delivered, and apparently the United States is part of the problem, not the solution.
Zelenskyy is also asking the U.S. to stop buying Russian oil, which amounts to about 3 to 4% of American consumption.
Guys like Putin, they don't stop. and we got to recognize that.
The White House and Congress are now pledging another $10 billion in humanitarian aid as Ukrainians leave their homeland.
More than 700,000 people have been forced to flee the violence perpetrated by Russia by crossing the border from Ukraine to Poland.
Secretary of State Blinken visited a refugee center in Poland as that country's leaders warned Putin there will be consequences for his actions.
Shelling residential areas, nuclear power plants are war crimes under international law, which are not subjected to statute of limitation.
The U.S. State Department and the Canadian government are now advising citizens to leave Russia immediately. This came as news emerged that Russia arrested WNBA star Brittany Griner last month, charging her with drug smuggling for allegedly having vape cartridges containing hashish oil in her carry-on luggage. This video reportedly showing the search was released by Russia Customs Service.
The problem is that there is no reliable, independent judiciary in Russia. So consequently, the expectation of a fair trial is not there.
Griner plays for a Russian team during the WNBA offseason. If convicted, she could spend up to 10 years in prison. Her agent says they are working on getting her back to the U.S. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
With the growing challenges to get into Ukraine, our teams have been reporting from neighboring countries for more than a week, covering the unprecedented refugee situation. But today, a first-hand look at the situation on the ground in Lviv. Mike Armstrong takes us through the journey to enter a now war-torn country.
This country is under a national curfew. Here in Lviv, it's effective as of 10 p.m. at night local time. You're no longer allowed on the streets, and you're not supposed to show any light through your windows. Now, our small team and large amount of gear left the city in Poland, where we've been staying at about 9:30 this morning. The trip to the Vīķe crossing was clear sailing, and then you hit the line. Now, as vehicles wait to get to the border, you're passed over and over by empty buses. They're picking up refugees who are on foot and taking them to refugee processing centers. Ukraine is running 27 right now. There's one very close to the Vīķe crossing. Now, leaving Poland, you go through their border, and then entering Ukraine, you go through theirs. Considering it meant entering a country that's literally fighting a war, it was actually quite easy. Then came this moment when we pulled out of the border facility and saw thousands of people waiting on foot to get through. There were audible gasps from our team. Moving from there, the shock came from the lineup of vehicles we were driving against.
Car after car, bus after bus.
This line stretched for about 4 kilometers. People sat, engines off, and waited. The crossing into Vīķe, Poland is the busiest of any border being used by Ukrainians to go to any neighboring country. In fact, according to the numbers put out by the Ukrainian border guard, it's actually twice as busy as the crossing in second place. From the border and into the town of Lviv, we passed or were stopped at about a dozen checkpoints. People were still building them, fortifying them. Now, arriving in Lviv, it felt quite normal. There was fairly heavy traffic. Things seemed to be somewhat busy. But then at about 9 p.m. local time, an air raid siren. Everyone in our hotel was told to go to the basement. That lasted about a half hour. But it's something people here are getting used to. It's been happening fairly regularly in this area, despite the fighting not really happening in this part of Western Ukraine. The curfew that is in place stays in place until 6 a.m. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Lviv, Ukraine.
The Canadian ambassador to Ukraine is in Poland, witnessing the flood of refugees arriving every day. Eric Sorensen spoke with her on the West Block about the determination and grief Ukrainians are experiencing. Eric.
Colleen, out of the destruction in Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have emerged, families with their children seeking refuge.
They are arriving in Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, many countries, but most, some 800,000 now, have come to Poland. Canada is preparing to take in Ukrainians, an unlimited number temporarily, with immigration rules being eased to make it happen quickly. Canada's ambassador to Ukraine, Larissa Galadza, is in Poland. She has been struck by the effort of the people needing help and those who are there to help, as she told us on the West Block.
There's this stoicism and this hardness about this determination in getting that done, and then they have their moments of deep grief and sadness and pain. They're being strong for their children. They're being strong for their colleagues in Ukraine. And for the moment, that means that Ukrainians inside Ukraine need to put up the fight of their lives.
The Russians have suggested that Western countries will eventually accept Ukraine's defeat and will move on. Galadze says the Russians are misjudging the resolve of the Ukrainians and the West.
It's not the first miscalculation I think that Russia has made, and the response that we're seeing from our like-minded governments, the response that we're seeing from Ukrainians themselves is unprecedented.
Canada, NATO, and other countries are helping on two fronts, delivering weapons and supplies to defend those trying to survive inside Ukraine, and beginning the humanitarian mission to welcome Ukrainians who've left and who want to come to this country. Colleen?
Eric Sorensen, thank you. And Eric is in for Mercedes Stevenson tomorrow, hosting the West Block, and you can catch the full interview Sunday right here on Global. For the second straight weekend, protesters in several major cities took to the streets in solidarity with the Ukrainian people. Several thousand gathered in Paris, waving Ukrainian flags opposing the Russian invasion. In London, protesters draped in blue and yellow flooded Trafalgar Square and joined in the singing of the Ukrainian national anthem. And this was the scene outside the Russian embassy in The Hague, hundreds chanting for an end to the Russian offensive. Among them, a large contingency of Russians who say Vladimir Putin does not represent them. In the U.S. Capitol, the National Guard and state police are on high alert, bracing for Canada-style convoy protests. American truckers from at least 3 different convoy groups are making their way to Washington to protest COVID-19 mandates and restrictions. The so-called Freedom Convoy follows demonstrations that erupted in Canada in late January, where protesters blocked U.S. border crossings in Ottawa's downtown core for 3 weeks. Coming up, the Latvian president's perspective on Putin and NATO's response to the war. As the war in Ukraine intensifies, one person who understands what refugees are going through is Vīķe-Freiberga, Latvia's first female president. She spent 50 years in exile after fleeing with her parents when Soviet forces invaded during World War II. Mercedes Stevenson is in the Latvian capital and spoke with Vīķe-Freiberga about that experience, the Russian president, and whether NATO will push back. Mercedes.
Vīķe-Freiberga's family fled Latvia when she was just a small child after the USSR invaded this country. By 1954, they had made their way to Canada, where she would stay, becoming a psychologist. But in 1998, she moved back here to Latvia, and just 1 year later, she became the country's president. Freedom and democracy are issues that are close to the former Latvian president's heart, and she speaks to them often and passionately. After the former president's family suffered terribly under authoritarianism, she has long warned about the threat of Vladimir Putin's regime in Russia. Today, she shared her analysis as a clinical psychologist on Putin's state of mind, which she believes played a role in his decision to go to war, and her belief that he has underestimated NATO.
He's a narcissist, a psychopath with no conscience whatsoever. And he's an megalomaniac. I think he's become, I'd say, notably unhinged in recent times. I think this invasion is not the actions of a sane man interested in the welfare of his country. So I do think he really is getting unhinged now. Before he was only evil and mean. Now he's also evil, mean, and unhinged. It's a bad combination.
Vīķe-Freiberga says the most important thing the West can do right now to starve Vladimir Putin's war efforts is to stop buying Russian oil and gas, which she says forms the war chest for the Russian leader to continue to fight. She also raised concerns about the elimination of the free press in Russia, saying it will become an intellectual prison for the Russian people. Sitting down with the former Latvian president is another reminder of the close ties between Canada and Latvia, a country where Canada currently has 540 soldiers stationed, with more on the way. Colleen?
Mercedes Stevenson in Latvia. Thanks, Mercedes. Still ahead, why cryptocurrency has become a double-edged sword in the Russia-Ukraine war. Cryptocurrency has emerged as a key factor in the war in Ukraine. Experts say it's likely to support citizens on both sides of the conflict as people take their money out of the traditional economy and move it into global digital currency. But as Ann Gaviola reports, it's unlikely to help Russia skirt economic sanctions.
The war in Ukraine comes with a horrific toll on the people involved, emotional and financial. Russia is spending an estimated $20 million a day to continue the invasion. The Ukrainian government hasn't put a price on its defenses, but it's issued war bonds to raise funds while also turning to less conventional methods. On Saturday, Ukraine's vice prime minister tweeted a request for donations in the world's largest cryptocurrencies. More than $69 million poured in from around the world for the Ukrainian government and NGOs.
This is actually a pretty good solution because it is something that the Russians cannot steal.
Finance professor Andreas Park says even if Russia gains control of Ukrainian banks, crypto remains safe. But unreliable internet complicates things with a need for access to move, sell, and use the digital currency. Elon Musk has activated his company's satellite internet service in Ukraine in a bid to help. Crypto is also being sent to Russian citizens in the midst of a spiraling recession, unable to use credit cards and with limited access to cash.
This is a tool that's going to be used for things you support, things that you may be against, but that the technology itself is politically neutral.
But that neutrality means authorities are on alert as Vladimir Putin and Russian oligarchs may turn to crypto to lessen the blow of sanctions. But blockchain experts say Bitcoin isn't liquid enough or deep enough to make a sizable dent.
But if we're looking at the order of magnitude that you need in order to meaningfully circumvent sanctions, the cryptocurrency world is just not ready for that. And it's traceable.
Cryptocurrency has emerged as a technological double-edged sword with the potential to help a movement that's captured the zeitgeist, outweighing its potential to limit sanctions. Ann Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
Italian police have seized villas and yachts belonging to 4 high-profile Russians who've been placed on an EU sanctions list. One of the people on that list is Alexei Mordashov, Russia's richest man. His $34 million yacht was impounded in Imperia. Earlier this week, Germany and France seized more yachts. Additional assets are expected to be seized in the coming days as further sanctions from Western countries are implemented against Russia. Why one Canadian town may be feeling the pain of the war on Ukraine more than any other. Next. Alberta has deep historical and human connections to Ukraine, and that's especially evident in Vegreville, east of Edmonton. It's a town built on Ukrainian roots, and the war, half a world away, is being met with despair. As Dan Grummett reports, residents are trying to help in whatever way they can.
From the largest Pasenka to the smallest Matrushka, so much here is distinctly Ukrainian.
You're actually bringing these in from the Ukraine, buying them from the families there to help support them in a sense.
Well, it supports them, yeah.
Greg Kurlik sells mostly Ukrainian-made goods. The only Russian-inspired products he carries have been taken off the shelf, put away in boxes.
That's going to hurt some artists in Ukraine. It's not going to, unfortunately, not going to hurt Putin. But that's the only thing I can do.
The Ukrainian-made dolls are still for sale. Kurlik's been thinking about the woman who makes them, who lives on the outskirts of Kyiv.
I haven't been able to contact her. I have no idea. Sorry. But anyways, I mean, it's a disaster.
Pain, despair, hope, pride. There's a range of emotions being felt by people in this community impacted by a situation they cannot control. What's it like watching what's happening?
It's horrific.
Ukrainians first came to the Vegreville area 130 years ago, lured by affordable land. First-generation Ukrainian-Canadian Natalia Toroshenko has lived here 40 years. She says a heaviness has come over the town.
It's pretty hard to live in Vegreville and ignore the Ukrainian-ness of it. And so, I mean, I think it affects all of us.
The 2016 census shows just over a third of Vegreville's population is of Ukrainian descent. Svitlana Fedoruk is one of them.
We can't really sleep much.
Fedoruk is originally from Snyatin in western Ukraine. Her sister is there. and won't leave.
I'm begging her to come, but she's scared to leave the house. Every morning we have to just find out if they're still alive. That's the worst thing.
For all the fear and uncertainty, the support here is more evident. Stories of determination emerging from Ukraine have also resonated.
President tut.
I've had a couple of calls and a couple of text messages. They'd like to rename this park after the president of Ukraine. Yeah, Zelenskyy Park.
I'm awfully glad that my great-grandfather chose to come.
Sold out of flags, Kuralik has ordered more T-shirts. Helping others show support is his way of showing support, a way to cope with what everyone's feeling inside.
Pray for peace, Slava Ukraina, that glory to Ukraine.
Dan Grummett, Global News.
And that is Global National for this Saturday night. I'm Colleen Christie. Tonight we leave you with a special moment of solace on the Polish border. Ukrainian refugees fleeing war are finding hope through music. Italian David Martello is there playing for peace. Known as Piano Man, Martello traveled from Germany with his instrument on wheels. He greeted the stream of women and children frightened and exhausted after leaving behind sons and fathers to try to bring some musical joy to their lives. He played Imagine by John Lennon and was joined on the keys by a Ukrainian woman who chose to play Queen's We Are the Champions. Thanks for watching.